I would now like to invite Nune Avetisyan to the stage for a poetry recitation.
Կաշխարում բանցրիկ մի Հայաստան աշխար, որն իր լաջվարդ, լազուր լեռներն ունի, և իր դաշտերն ունի ասես նշխար, երկիրն այդ հին է, նաև լեռնապատ, առասպելապատ, կաշխարում բանցրիկ մի Հայաստան աշխար, ու կլինի հավետ, ով աստվածային դժնի դժողքում ծիծաղած դանդ է, միթե չպիտի հայոց դժողքում արցունքդ կաթե, կկաթե, ասիրտդ կնջրվում, իմ սրտի նման և մեջքդ է ծրվում, տես սյուներն ահա կախաղանների, այս ինչ է տերիմ, աստված իմ անգութ, կախաղանասյուն ողջանտար մի մութ, անհամար Հիսուս ծարերից կախված, Հիսուսից էլ սուրբ հայերն իմ բարի, յաթաղանի դեմ Հիսուսից խապված, խաչ բռնած ընդեմ յաթաղանների, անզեն Հիսուսներ, զինված զորքի դեմ, ահա թե մեր բախտն ինչով էր դժխեմ, մանուկներ կախված, Հիսուսներ թխլիկ, հայրեր ու մայրեր, եղբայրներ խաչված, չես ընկրկելով արդար գալիք, չես սփոփելու իմ սիրտը խապված, ախ պիտի դատես, ով մեծ դատախաս, թե մնայու լույ է վրեժս երաս, դու դեռ ծիծաղես պիտի, ով դահիճ, բայց ահա, անել կախված մի կտրիչ, լեզուն էր հանել, կախված տեղովն էլ, լեզուն էր հանում ոսոխի վրա, լեզուն կրակե ծիծաղը նրա, անշե չրի պես կախվածի լեզուն, անմիտ կախողի ցեղին էր կիզում, քանզի կախողից բարձր է կախվողը, ահա թե ինչու, թալյատ ոսոխը խոլ հրամայեց, վար կախաղանից, ցած բերեք, լեզուն պոկեք բերանից, ու ցած բերեցին, լեզուն պոկեցին, բայց հայոց լեզուն մի բերանում չէ, հայոց մայր լեզուն գետերն են հայոց, հրազդանն հավերժ պիտի ողանջե, պիտի մռնչա մայր արաքսնայոց, հայ լեզուն թուրն է քաջ անդրանիկի, որ պիտի խոսի նման կայծակի, մենք խաղաղ էինք մեր լեռների պես, դուք հողմերի պես խուժեցիք վայրակ, մենք ձեր դեմ ելանք մեր լեռների պես, դուք հողմերի պես ոռնացիք վայրակ, բայց մենք հավերժ ենք մեր լեռների պես, դուք հողմերի պես կկորչիք վայրակ, իմ սուրբ հայրենիք, դու սրտիս մեջ ես, դու սրտիս մեջ ես, ոչ լեզվիս վրա, իմ սրտի միջից թե սիրտս ճեղքես, դրոշիտ բոցը պիտի հուրարա, չեմ ուզում գոռալ իմ սիրո մասին, սակայն իմացիր հայրենիքի մեծ, քեզ 100 տեղով խոցեց թշնամին, բայց 1000 տեղով իմ սիրտը խոցվեց, ես ամբողջովին քոնն եմ հայրենիք և մոմի նման ճամփեքիդ վրա, քո փառքի համար թե մի օր վառվիմ, մոխրաբից անգամ ինձնից չի մնա, ես իմ անուշ Հայաստանի արևահամբարն եմ սիրում, մեր հին սազի ողբանվակ, լացակումած լարն եմ սիրում, Արնանման ծաղիկների ու վարդերի բույր վարման ու նայրյան աղջիկների հեզաճկուն պարն եմ սիրում, սիրում եմ մեր երկինքը մուկ, ջրերը ջինջ, լիճը լուսե, արևն ամռան ու ձմեռվա վիշապաձայն բուքը վսեմ, մտնում կորած խրճիթների անհյուրընկալ պատերը սև ու հնամյա քաղաքների հազարամյա կարն եմ սիրում, Չեմ մոռանա ես ողբազան երգերը մեր, չեմ մոռանա աղոթք դարձած, երկաթագիր գրքերը մեր, ինչքան էլ սուր սիրտը խոցեն, արյունական վերքերը մեր, էլի ես որբ ու առնավար, իմ Հայաստան յարն եմ սիրում, իմ կարոտած սրտի համար, ոչ մի ուրիշ հեքիաթ չկա, նարեկացուկ ու չակի պես լուսապսակ ճակատ չկա, աշխար անցիր, Արարատի նման ջերմակ գագաթ չկա, ինչպես անհաս փառքի ճամփա, ես իմ մասիս սարն եմ սիրում։ Շնորհակալ եմ։ Մեզ են գլխից են զարկել, բայց նորեն հայերն ապրել են, ապրում են, կապրեն, 1000 դարեր են զարկել, բայց նորեն հայերն ապրել են, ապրում են, կապրեն, եղեռնազարկ էլ եղանք, բայց նորեն հայերն ապրել են, ապրում են, կապրեն, ով էլ որ զարկի, ինչքան էլ զարկեն, հայերն ապրել են, ապրում են, կապրեն։
I would now like to invite Ara Kazanjan to present the ARF Arshavir Shiragyan Gomide message.
Հարկելի հյուրեր, սիրելի ներկաներ, այն օրեն, երբ Իթիհադ իր թատերում մեջ արավ Ֆաթիհի սերունդին ջագադակիրը վարելու կորձը, դեսողությունը բղդորած էր արդեն ասկայնամոլ երանտով, թադողությունն ալ խատարված, հբադակ ասկերու դրված, ամեն առանցնաշնորում ու նվիրականություն ոտնագողելու մարմաչով, վասնզի ձվարած էր համա իսլամության զարանցանքին մեջ, ու զինված Թուրքիան միմիայն Թուրքին նշանապանով։ Հյուրիեթեն այստին անդեսավ թե ինչպես ծերպազատ հայը գծկտեր ընդլայնել իր մտավոր հորիզոնը, զար գուդար արևդուրի պարկավաճման, ագումբ ումպեմ գշատցներ, մամուլը գարդատրել անթուլ։ Անդեսավ մանավանդ, որ հայը որքան պարաշուկ կրծեր էր դոնել իր քիրերու կիդին ու դբակրության գրտնակ հոպելյանները։ Եվ նախանցը գուբրի պես կթանցրանար ու գխմորվեր ներսիտին։ Ուստի որոշեց թևադել իր շուրջի ոչ իսլամ դարերեն հայը միայն, զոր օժդված կդեստեր հարաշտիմության ցիրկերով։ Եվ ահա շարանը սարսափի ծևերուն, բանդին ու շղտային, յատաղանին ու գախաղանին, մանավանդ այն անվերջ գարավաններուն, ուր մահը դարձավ մխիթարություն։ 100 դարիներ անցած են այդ զարհուրելի թվականեն եւ անցնող 100 դարիները արդեն ահավոր ավեր կործած են եւ դագավին գկործեն։ 100 դարիներու ընթացքին հայը չմորցավ սակայն արհավիրքի այդ թվականը եւ վերաբրելով բանջադիրության վերարգուն հակած ամեն դարի անտատար հիշեցուց Թուրքին, հիշեցուց աշխարհին, որ բադմությունը սև ջագադակիր մդնորին ազերմեզի եւ մենք մեր գամքով ու հարադեվ աշխատանքով պատրաստ ենք փոխելու այդ ընթացքը եւ դիրանալու մեր արտար իրավունքներուն։ Հիմա ավելի քան երբեք անհրաժեշտ է լարել, բազմապատկել ուժերը, օդարացումի սպառնալիքին թեմ ամրապնդվելու համար։ Պետք է գիտակցիլ, որ հայտադը միայն հողային բանջ չէ։ Մեր տադը է նաեւ լեզու, է նաեւ մշակույթ։ Մեր տադը մեր քաղաքագրթության պահպանումն ու պաշտպանությունն է։ Այս ուղղությամբ հայ հեղափոխական դաշնակցությունը իր բոլոր գառույցներով բատնեշի վրա է միշտ եւ պիտի շարունակե բանջադիրության ու ասկապահպանման բոլոր աշխատանքները։ Մենք պետք է որ գիտակցենք, որ հայությունը ապրիլ 24 չէ միայն, այլ հայությունը մշակույթ է, պատմական հարուստ անցյալ եւ քոյամար։ Սորվինք մեր լեզուն, քուրքուրանք մեր մշակույթին վրա եւ այն ժամանակ Թուրքին բարդությունը Երևան գել է։ Սիրելիներ, այս դարվան ապրիլ 24-ին մեր բոլորին ներկայությունը անհրաժեշտ է դեպի թրքական հիբադոսարան ուղվելիք փողոք քայլարշավին, ցույց տալու աշխարհին, որ դարիները որքան սահին ու հերանան, մորնալու փոխարեն մենք ավելի կոդեբնտված ենք ու դարձած առավել բանջադեր։ Իսկ երբ արշավելով թրկական հիբադոսարան հասնենք, այդ մեկը ընենք գլուխնից բարձր բռնած հբարդորեն, քանի որ մեր նախնիկները եղած են դիկրան մեծ լուսասունցի Դավիթը, Գոմիդասն ու Արամ Մանուկյանը, քանի որ մեր նախնիկները Վանի Թեմուսալերան, Սարդարաբադի եւ Արցախի մեջ ձունգի բերած են թուրքը։ Թուրքը իր հերկումի քաղաքականությունը որքան գուզե թող երկարե, այնքան ադեն որ գանկուն կմնա Արարատլերը, հայը միշտ պիտի ցկտի անոր։ Սիրելի ներկաներ, թողտոչ մատներով ձեր սրդի սկիհին մեջ ամփոփեցեք մեր մեծ մերելներուն նշխարները, սրբազան հաղորդության համար եւ անոնցմով զրահվեցեք այն գրիվին, որ կսպասե մեզի, այն գրիվին, որ կգոչվի ցեղին կոյամարդը, գանցնին բոլոր ամյակներն ու տշպախտությունները, ինչ որ կմնա, ժողովուրդն է իր պեղուն երանքներով ուր գերևին վաղվան բոլոր հաղթանակները։ Շնորհակալություն։
I'd now like to invite Paila Kevorkian, accompanied by Alex Berberian, to perform a musical performance.
մտքոթում նուրի մարներ ատում դեսնեի այն արում գարատում ես անհուն որ ամեն մի կարմին չրերում վարարում գարգաչում ես արերում դեսնեի այն արում գարատով ես անհուն որ ամեն մի կարմին չրերում վարարում գարգաչում ես արերում Թեքվեի աղբերին գարոտած բաղջրին նիրեի անցերում մեր կանաչ մարգերում ուր դաղդունքներ պուրում ուրմանում որերում Հովներ ինձ միշտ ամպուրում Նինեի անցերում մեր կանաչ մարգերում ուր ձաղդունքներ պուրում ուրմանում որերում Հովներ ինձ միշտ ամպուրում Հայրենիք իմ սրդում թե չնեմ ես մարդում Նախ իմ այր թանգակի դուն գակամ ես կարգին նսպոպեմ քո հոգին ամպույրով սրդակին Գասեմ եմ քեզ իմ գարցքին Նախ իմ այր թանգակին Դուն գակամ ես կարգին նսպոպեմ քո հոգին ամպույրով սրդակին Գասեմ եմ քեզ իմ գարցքին Նախ իմ Նախ իմ Նախ իմ
Haig Oshagan was born in Beirut, Lebanon, and immigrated to the United States with his parents and family in 1975. He attended the University of Pennsylvania for his BA and received his doctorate from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He has taught at Stanford University, at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and is currently a professor in the Communication Department at Wayne State University in Detroit, where he has been Director of Media Arts and Studies Program. He is also on the executive board of the Wayne State University Faculty Union. Haig Oshagan's research is on the influence of the mass media. His many articles explore the ways in which the media affects perceptions and frame debates. His current work is on media representations of minorities, on issues of social diversity, and on the role of ethnic media in society. Oshagan is also the founder and president of New Michigan Media, which is the network of ethnic media in Michigan. Currently, he is involved in the revitalization of the city of Detroit, working with the Detroit City Council's Immigration Task Force, the Mayor's Office, and Governor Snyder's Global Michigan Commission. Haig Oshagan has been a longtime member of the Armenian Cultural Foundation and the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. He has chaired his local Detroit chapter, has chaired the Eastern region of the USA, has been member of the Arf Bureau, and he was the editor of the Armenian Review. He is currently the chairman of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, Eastern region of the United States. Please welcome Haiko Shagan.
Հոյ դա արևմտյան շրջանի ներկայացուցիչ, հոմենտմենի, համասկայինի, AYF-ի, հոմի ներկայացուցիչներ, սիրելի բարեկամներ եւ Արշավիր Շիրակյան Կոմիտեի, thank you for inviting me today to share today with you and the chance to give you my remarks. As you heard already in the film presentation, by 1915, Turkey had already lost Libya, and as well Bulgaria, Greece, Bosnia, Serbia, and Albania. It is in this context of losing its empire that Turkey began to think of consolidating what it already had not lost. This is the context of the genocide. This is when the Turkish government decides to cleanse the territories of any minorities that might want to become independent and might want to take parts of Turkey away from the state. On April 24, 1915, the Turkish Interior Ministry issues the order for arresting Armenian political leaders across the major cities of Turkey. You heard on this day how many of our political and artistic and cultural and organizational leaders were rounded up and imprisoned or assassinated. The evidence for the genocide is overwhelming. There is really no way to dispute what occurred. There are archives you heard on the film from ambassadors, representatives of the German, American, British, French, and other nations. There are journalistic reports, there are forensic reports. We know that there were over 2 million Armenians in Turkey before 1915, and then the number drops to 150,000. There are mass graves that we have found. There is a great deal of research now in genocide studies trying to understand exactly what happened. We don't have a document that says, go and do this by the Turkish ministry, but there's a tremendous amount of documentation that makes it hard to dispute. The procedures, the routes, the CUP, the relocation laws, the repossession laws, the Islamicized Armenians, the Kurdish participation, the German advice. All of this is part of the record against Turkey. In addition, there are all the oral testimonies of people whose relatives went through the genocide. You already heard a few, and I'll tell you that in my case, on my grandfather's side, Hago Poshagan is the leading novelist of the last 100 years in Armenian literature, friend of Krikor Zohrab and others. On the 23rd, someone knocked on his door and told him not to stay there that night. He didn't know who it was, but he heeded the advice. He didn't stay that night where he was living. Krikor Zohrab was given the same advice, by the way, and he ignored it. My grandfather, Hago Poshagan, was on the run for 3-4 years in Bolis, in Turkey. He walked around, he moved at night, slept during the day, hid during the day. He was captured a few times, 6 times, but he escaped each time, eventually making his way to Bulgaria to start anew. My mother's side is somewhat similar. They were warned not to stay in the city that they were in. They had money, however, and they spent all of their money bribing their way so that they could escape and ended up in Haleb. They are part of the generation that survived. And you know, this is the 100th commemoration of the genocide. It's also, in a real way, the 100th anniversary of the Spirk. This is 100 years of our diaspora, of our modern diaspora. And for all the work that's been done on the genocide, as an aside, I think we're missing part of our history. No one's done the history of the diaspora, you know. I mean, there are no records of. How many of you have seen a story of Burj Hamud or of Haleb or of Marseille, or of Boston, or of Los Angeles, or Fresno. This story, these are our survival. This is our victory, in a way. And I'd like one day to be able to see picture books of the stores and shopkeepers in Burj Hamud, and the streets and the schools, and our lives in all of these places that we ended up in because of the genocide. We need to pay more attention to this part of the history. In the diaspora, 1965 marks an important date. That is the beginning of our recognition agenda. That is when we begin to demand recognition from Turkey. And in this effort, we have created a very powerful political culture. We have galvanized our communities. We have created organizations and bodies like the ANCA. We have been able to create a culture of confrontation, demonstration, demands. Our youth know all the songs. They know the Fedayis, the heroes, all the important dates. And we have maintained an Armenian identity tied to recognition, to political demands that we make. And we have had recognition success, too. Over 20 countries have recognized the genocide. It's important to appreciate what we have done so far since 1965. The politicization of our communities through this recognition agenda has allowed our voice to be heard and has given us what we haven't had before, a really very powerful ethical and moral argument. A moral argument, an ethical argument is important because it's a way of harnessing political power. Maybe in an ideal world, all you need are laws. But in the real world, you need political will. And when your numbers are small and money is limited, it's hard to make a difference in politics. This is where morality and ethics comes in. And it can be crucial in arguments for human rights, laws, legal decisions, and political decisions. Think of all the weak groups that have been able to change the world. I mean, Gandhi in taking, pushing back British rule in India, Mandela in South Africa, the civil rights movement here. These are not powerful sides that are able to push back a much more powerful order because they had the moral and ethical argument on their side. We have been able to do this because of the recognition agenda. The entire denial argument by the Turks is to undermine this strength that we have. Our recognition campaigns, our ANCAs, our grassroots efforts, our friendly congressmen, senators, mayors, politicians, alliances with other organizations and peoples, academic research have all been a kind of pressure that we will need now for the reparation agenda. It is time to move on, I think, from recognition to the next phase. We have done well in recognition. We have built a great deal of political capital. We have made the research that shows the genocide happened. Doesn't matter if the Turks deny it. It is now to move our political struggle towards reparation. I gave my first speech on reparation about 15 years ago in Chicago on April 24th. At the time, very few people talked of reparation. Recognition was the argument that we were pushing. The fear was that if you started talking about reparations, we would lose our friends in Congress, that this was too extreme. But I think times have changed, and I think we've done well to get to this point. It is, however, a difficult topic. I will take the rest of my time to talk about reparation and put it in some context and discuss other reparations as well and other claims as well around the world. Reparation has the word repair in it. And this is the central idea of reparations, that you have to repair some damage that you have done. And repair is not just land, it's not just money. There is psychological repair too. Repair is a broad term. There are three kinds of harm that reparations can repair. The first is probably the most difficult one. It is the kind of harm that's permanent, that you cannot undo in any way, that you cannot really compensate for. This is permanent damage. This is physical harm, deaths, suicides, people who would have been born but who never were. There's psychological harm here, loss of family, rape, degradation. There's a psychological harm of witnessing, of seeing someone be killed. You saw the survivor, she's actually from Detroit, telling the story of how the Turks tore the baby out of the stomach and she could not remember it. We all know people who will just not talk of the genocide. They lived through it, but they could never come to discuss it. This is the psychological damage and harm of genocide. There's also the harm that comes from losing a community. It's not individuals in this sense, but it's an entire community of schools and churches and agums and institutions. And this is torn apart as well during this kind of permanent harm and damage. And this does not stop. There's intergenerational passing of the genocidal issues. There's internalization. It affects families. It affects people growing up. And denial, of course, just prolongs it. Denial makes it worse. There is another kind of damage, and that's material damage. It's much easier to deal with material damage. It includes property, land, buildings, businesses, churches, but it also involves things that aren't unmovable. For example, livestock, jewelry, machinery, artwork, money. These can be counted and can be in some other fashion repaired, but reparation is not easy. How do you repair the destruction of a city or a village? Can you put a price? Maybe you can put a price on the buildings and the land, but what about the people who were killed? What about the people who suffered? What about the damage done to the survivors who saw it, who had to leave and start their families and their lives somewhere else? And what about all those who weren't born? You know, President Bush, when the war in Iraq ended, put the number of casualties, deaths from the war in Iraq at 35,000. Some years later, medical journal Lancet went into Iraq and did a survey of 7,000 households to understand the impact of the war in Iraq. And they estimate the casualty of the war based on how many people were not born because of the war at 655,000. It's a very different number, 35,000 and 655,000. But how do you repair this kind of a loss? Professor Ovanesyan has estimated that had the genocide not occurred, Armenia today would be a country of 20 million people. How do you repair that kind of a damage? There's a third kind of a damage too. There's a hybrid kind of a damage, where part of it is physical and part of it is countable. The best example of this is slavery. Slavery is partly a physical harm, psychological harm, but partly it can also be counted, because as a slave, your labor is countable. The United States has had slavery in our past. We had slavery. There are records in plantations of how many hours slaves worked and what that number is worth. I can tell you that in 1865, the US government decided to compensate slaves for slavery. The formula was 40 acres and a mule for every slave. The Freedmen's Bureau was established to distribute 850,000 abandoned and confiscated land back to slaves, freed slaves. It was never done, obviously. In 1989, Congressman Conyers from Michigan, actually, from Detroit, introduced House Resolution number 40. It's called Commission to Study Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. The idea is that we need to pay, in some way, repair the damage done through slavery. The Armenian genocide is one of the first genocides of the 20th century, but it's not obviously the last or only one. Many nations have genocidal pasts. A short list includes the United States, us, with Native Americans, Canada with Native Canadians, Australia with Aborigines, Argentina with the Mapuche, Germany with the Holocaust, the Soviet Union with the Ukraine, the Khmer Rouge with Cambodia, China with Tibet, Serbians with Bosnia, Hutu with Rwanda, Russia with Chechnya, Sudan with Darfur. When looking over all of these and the reparation types of claims that I've come across, 5 elements seem to be common and key in all reparations. The first of the 5 is a trial. Those guilty need to be brought to account. Secondly is recognition and an apology. It's important to apologize, to be sincere, to say, yes, we did it, and we should never have done it. The apology makes any compensation later on not be blood money. It becomes a sincere form of repair. After recognition and apology, there's the compensation part. This is return of property, land. This is a figuring a way of compensating for other kinds of losses and damage. Number 4 is helping the survival of the group that was harmed. Groups that are harmed have lost their institutions, they have lost their families, they have lost their jobs, they have lost their homes. Something has to be done to help them survive. And reparation packages include some aspect of the country that caused the damage to help the people survive. And number 5, and importantly, and others mentioned, is rehabilitation of the perpetrator. That is, the country that caused the damage needs to change. Whatever caused a country to commit genocide, that doesn't just disappear. That has to be worked on. Whatever racism, whatever anger, whatever perspective they had on minorities that caused them to commit a genocide has to be also repaired within a country. When the reparations are successful, all of these work. For example, apartheid ending in South Africa and the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions had all of these. And the Germans with the Holocaust also went through all of this. So how do you get to reparations? How do you get to this place? There are 2 kinds of ways of getting to reparations. The first is through political pressure, and the second is through legal pressure. Political pressure is primarily through political or economic sanctions. We all know we have sanctions against different countries around the world. This economic, Iran, for example, is now at a table negotiating nuclear disarmament because of economic sanctions. These are powerful tools that countries have, but it's difficult to see economic sanctions against Turkey. There is another sort of sanction, though, maybe thought of as a reward. Turkey joining the EU, for example, could be seen as a reward for, and a form of pressure for Turkey to get to the reparation stage. There is one final kind of pressure, political pressure, and that's from inside a nation. From inside a country, there is often pressure that comes up to understand what happened and what the past was about. You saw the demonstrations after Hrant Dink was assassinated. There is a movement in Turkey to be more open and understand what happened with the Armenians. There are now conferences in Turkey. There is on the 24th a demonstration in Bolis for the genocide. There is an opening up slowly, even though there are penal codes and punishments. There is an opening up in Turkey in different sectors about the genocide. It's talked about more and more and more. And it is a matter of time, I think, eventually, for the generational shift to really want to see what happened. This is not uncommon. It's not just in Turkey. You know, 70 years of Soviet rule. Does the KGB bear any responsibility for what they did during the Soviet times? Thousands of people disappeared from the Soviet Union. The KGB was responsible for it. Should they be punished in some way? Well, who was the head of the KGB? The last head of the KGB was Putin himself. And Putin, President Putin, has locked up the KGB archives. He has said, no one will see the KGB archives because it is not healthy for Mother Russia for us to see what happened over the last 70 years. And so the KGB archives are locked up and no one will be punished. But eventually it will open up. Eventually Putin will step down. Eventually, a generation in Russia will open up the archives and see exactly what the state did. The second way is through legal pressure. Here we have the courts. There are courts within Turkey, there are courts outside. The New York Life insurance case is an example of the courts at work. You can go, if you have paperwork, into Turkish courts even and claim land. You don't need to be the thing doesn't have to be called genocide for this part to work. If you have deeds, you can go and claim them in courts. But if you want to go beyond that, but if we want to get to the point of land reparations, then genocide has to step in. It has to be called the genocide. And for this, we need international organizations. This is the United Nations, the application of the 1948 Genocide Convention, and other legal measures from the UN. A sampling would be the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Declaration of Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power, the Basic Principles and Guidelines on the Right to Reparation for Victims of Gross Violations of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, the Convention Against Torture. All of these are ways of forcing through legal means for Turkey to admit and come to reparations. There's also the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. The last and third way, legally, is through treaties. And the one treaty we talk about is the Sèvres Treaty. The Sèvres Treaty is about land return. There is no other way to take parts of Turkey away from Turkey except through these sorts of means. There is debate about whether Sèvres applies. You know, April 26, 1920, the Allied powers asked President Woodrow Wilson to determine a border for Armenia. A month later, May 17, 1920, President Wilson said yes, he would do it. And the Wilsonian Arbitral Award we're all familiar with includes the vilayets, the provinces of Erzurum, Trebizond, Van, and Bitlis, which he drew as belonging to Armenia. The treaty itself was never ratified. The signers, which would have been Armenia, Belgium, Britain, Czechoslovakia, France, Greece, Italy, Japan, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Serb, Croat, Slovene state, and Turkey, these would have signed the Sèvres Treaty, never signed it. But there is an aspect of international law that says that once an arbitration application is made and accepted, the arbitration decision becomes binding, even if the treaty itself is not signed. This is a debatable issue, obviously, because eventually there is the Lausanne Treaty of 1923 between Turkey, Britain, France, Italy, Japan, Greece, and Romania. And that doesn't include the Wilsonian borders. A few weeks ago in New York, we had a conference on the genocide, and I had the chance to speak with Jeffrey Robertson. Jeffrey Robertson, is the human rights attorney, founder of Dowdy Street Chambers. Amal Clooney works for him, representing the state of Armenia. And Jeffrey Robertson is a highly accomplished attorney. He was a United Nations judge for Sierra Leone. He's defended Salman Rushdie and Julian Assange of WikiLeaks. In his opinion, the Sèvres cannot work. That is, Wilson's arbitral borders will not hold up in international law. But again, it's a matter of us figuring out whether or not there is room for Sèvres, because it's the most direct way of land reparations. What would a complete package look like for us? If we could ask for a complete reparations package from Turkey, what would it include based on the 5 items I mentioned? Well, the first one, punishment, doesn't apply anymore. The perpetrators of the genocide, where some of them were tried, some of them actually got sentences, some of their sentences were commuted, many of them escaped, left Turkey, and as you know, many of them were assassinated through Operation Nemesis. The second, recognition and apology. What we would want from Turkey in a reparations package is complete acceptance, recognition of the crime, and a complete apology for what they did. This would include an accounting of exactly what happened. They would have to open their archives and show us exactly everything they have. Who gave what orders, what officers were involved, how it was planned out, who was implicated, what records they have of Armenians who were killed, what records they have of villages that were rounded up, what records they have of names that were killed. Secondly, they would need to have an educational component. They would have to teach the genocide in Turkey to Turkish school children. That is, just as the Germans teach about the Holocaust, the Turks would have to teach their young generations what they did during the genocide. And finally, they would need to show a sincere commemoration, a way of really showing how they understand the damage that they did. And this would involve public events, commemorations. This would involve museums. You know, they have changed over 90,000 names in Turkey from 1915 to today, changing Armenian names into Turkish names. Whether it was a river or a street or a neighborhood, all these names have been Turkified. And there should be an acceptance that these were Armenian names because these were Armenian lands, and that these names should be returned, they should become Armenian again. Number three, Turkey would need to support the Armenian nation. Help us survive. This is not just for Armenia. This is also for the diaspora. This is what Germany has done. This is what Turkey would need to do. They would need to put aside some money and some funds, as well as some political leverage to help Armenia and the Armenian nation. They would have to stop the blockade, obviously. They would give diplomatic help to Armenia in negotiating with Russia or the United States. They would have to make financial investments in Armenia, favorable trade negotiations, help with the Syrian Armenians, help with the diaspora, help us when we need money for a school or for a church or for a community center. This is what the Germans have done. This is what helping the survivors is about, because you caused the harm. You caused us to be here, have to rebuild our communities, rebuild our lives. You are responsible for the state of things. You should help. Fourth is rehabilitation of Turkey. The racism that pervaded Turkish society, that allowed them to exterminate the nation, is still there. That racism has to be removed. It has to be expunged. It has to be cleaned. This is not a modern state. This is not a democracy until it can deal with its past and with its present. We all know how Hrant Dink was killed. That spirit, that malevolent spirit in Turkey has to be cleaned. Article 301 in their penal code has to be removed, obviously. And finally, we get to the compensation part. There has to be compensation for death and suffering. There has to be return of land and businesses. There has to be transfer of land. The difficulty for us partly comes here. How do you calculate this? How do you calculate loss? When you think of the genocide, how do you put any kind of a price on it? It's not difficult to do the property side of things, the lands. You know, in a couple of weeks, the mayor of Diyarbakir is going to come to New York City. We're bringing him there, and we're expecting him to make this announcement saying any Armenian who has any evidence of property in Diyarbakir, you are welcome to come back and reclaim your land. You're welcome to come back, claim your property, and if someone is living there, we'll give you something similar in Diyarbakir. This is the announcement we're expecting him to make. These are deeds, this is evidence, this is paperwork. If you have it, you can go and claim it. The difficulty comes when we talk of death and suffering. How do you put a price on death and suffering? The New York Life case put a price on it. New York Life had 8,000 policies for a total value of about $10 million. That works out for a human life at a time valued at $1,250 per person. If you add half of that value for suffering, you can put a calculated price on death at $1,875 and suffering at $625. This is what New York Life case did. If you calculate that then on that basis with the number of Armenians who died, and taking into account inflation, you get a value of about $70 billion as a price for a genocide. An alternative is to go by the way in which the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 calculated death and suffering. This is the Sevres Treaty, but they calculated this. The special committee of the first subcommittee of the Paris Peace Conference's Commission on Reparations of Damage. The chair of the committee was General McKinstry from the US and Colonel Peel from England. They looked at Turkish Armenia and they looked at the provinces. They looked at the losses suffered in the cities and urban areas, and they looked at general damage. If you take their numbers, the loss now becomes $104 billion. If you average the two, you are at $87 billion. Who would pay this? Turkey would pay this, obviously. But who gets compensated? So who gets $87 billion? How do you figure that? This is where reparations is very difficult. This is where reparations can damage our communities or help our communities. How do you divide up the money? One option is obviously to create some kind of a commission made up of Armenia and of diasporan organizations, leaders of the communities, to decide how the money would be split. Another option people have proposed is that every living Armenian gets an equal share. We are, after all, descendants of the genocide. We were all harmed. That's why we are here in the first place. If we are 9 million people, and you take the average, that works up to about maximum, with the highest number, $11,600 per person. A family of 4 is $50,000. That's not small money, especially in Armenia. That's a lot of money. Another way to look at it might be to say it should all go to Armenia, or that we should figure out who lost what family members, and they should get it. Obviously, you see how difficult this is. Reparations is what we want. We are at the stage of restitution. Hadutsman semineng, բայց հարցը իրապես part է. And we need to think through this ourselves about where we want to take restitution and reparations. I haven't even mentioned land yet. How do you transfer land? You know, the Armenian vilayets where Armenians lived before 1915 included Erzurum, Van, Bitlis, Diyarbakir, Sivas, Kharpert, and Cilicia. The Wilsonian award is smaller, Erzurum, Trebizond, Van, and Bitlis. And who gets the land? If you transfer land from Turkey, what happens to that land? Is it Armenia? Is it Armenia's land? Is Armenia the spokesperson for all of the Armenian nation? And if you are from a village in Bitlis, but you have no paperwork, how does that work exactly? Others have proposed that we don't want maybe all of that land. Instead, maybe we should just get Mount Ararat and part of Trebizond so that we have an option to the sea, and Turkey builds a seaport for us. These are the difficult issues in reparations. There are lots of examples of reparations around the world and claims of reparations around the world. None of them is simple, but now some of them have been worked out. And I'll give you some examples of reparations, both claims and solutions. Currently, the one that's closest to us is the Cuban case. President Obama has proposed opening and normalizing relations with Cuba. Well, there's reparations with Cuba, because Cubans who had to escape Cuba left everything behind. Fidel Castro in 1959, after the revolution, nationalized entire industries, hotels, casinos, businesses, farms, ranches. Right now, with the Department of Justice, there are 5,900 claims of reparations from Cuba. The total value with interest is $7 billion. Cuba wants Guantanamo in return. And they have said that they are due reparations because of the blockade since 1960. And that they want to put a price on how much American blockade has hurt Cuba. There are lots of examples of monetary reparations. In our case, again, in 1988, the US government admitted to the relocation camps that we had during World War II for Japanese Americans. I don't know, how many of you know this, but President Roosevelt, FDR, signed into law Executive Order 9066. 120,000 Japanese Americans were taken from their homes by military jeeps into the Arizona-Nevada desert, into concentration camps, where they lived for the next 2 years. The US government apologized and awarded each Japanese American $20,000 as reparations. So $1.2 billion overall. In Europe, after World War II, the Allies imposed $320 billion reparation cost on Germany for the war. Perhaps the most famous reparation case is with the Jewish nation, Germany and the Jews. In the initial reparation phase, Germany paid Israel $2 billion for the victims of Nazi persecution, $952 million for personal indemnities. They put the price of concentration camps at $35.70 per month per inmate. They paid $820 million to Israel later on to resettle 50,000 Jewish immigrants to Israel. There have been other payments as well down the years. The last one in 1990, where Austria paid $25 million to survivors. There aren't that many examples of land reparation, but the best one is in Canada. The Nunavut, this is the Canadian Inuit, Eskimos, were given 350,000 square miles by the Canadian government, part of the Northwest Territories, for the damage and harm the Canadians had done in taking over Canada from the local populations. The Nunavut territory, if you look on a map today, is new. It's from 1999, and it's a reparation for harm done. There's a lot to say here, but I'm going to stop with this here and say that over the last 100 years, the world has learned something that we have known for a long time. The idea that there is no peace without justice. That there can be no lasting peace anywhere where there remains injustice, where there is no resolution for the crimes committed, where there is no accountability, where there is no responsibility. This is impunity. And impunity has always been a key cause for commission of crimes. Gishem Yev Gebahanchem, as they sang earlier, never goes away. When a crime is committed that goes unpunished, it is never forgotten. It has to be resolved eventually. And for us, with all this behind us and with us, we are now pursuing an agenda of full reparations from Turkey. We will have a future where justice prevails, where reparations are made, where Armenia is secure, where Turkey is rehabilitated, where the diaspora is strong, and where the martyred Armenian nation has been finally avenged. You know, our grandparents' generation struggled for survival and established the modern diaspora. Our parents' generation laid the foundation for the political struggle for recognition of the genocide. Our legacy and the young people here, their legacy, the AYF's legacy, the kids' legacy, will be to see our national struggle for justice to its finish. Everything is possible, Paragamner, but it will take our united political will to do it. But we will, and we will succeed. Thank you.
I would now like to present patriotic songs as performed by Hamaskaya and Sayat Nova Choir, arranged and conducted by Nora Rumyan Bayramyan. I would now like to invite Reverend Razmin Khachadurian on stage for a prayer.
Բոլորս միասին հայր մեր աղոթենք։ Օրհնյալ Տեր մեր Հիսուս Քրիստոս ամեն հայր մեր, որ հերգինս ես Սուրբ Եղիցի անուն քո, եկեսցե արքայություն քո, եղիցին գամ քո, որպես հերգինս եւ հերգրի, ըսհաց մեր հանաբազոր դուր մեզ այսօր, եւ թող մեզ զբարդիս մեր, որպես եւ մեկ թող մերոց բարդաբանած, եւ մի դանիրս մեզի փորձություն, այլ բրգիազ մեզի չարեն, զիկոյ արքայություն եւ զորություն եւ բարք հավիդյանս ամեն, հոգվոց սնանկուցելոց Քրիստոս ասված, արանքիստ եւ ողորմություն եւ մեզ մեղավորած շնորհի աստողություն անցանած, Դեր ողորմյա, Դեր ողորմյա, Դեր ողորմյա, Քրիստոս որդի Աստուծոանու խագալ եւ բարեկուտ, Քեթակ օրարչական սիրով դյոքի սանկուցյալ ծարայից կոց, եւ մանամանդ հիշյա դեր ըս հոգիսն, առավել քան 1.5 միլիոն նահատակածն ազգիս հայոց, որ անգան հնդատս համաշխարային առաջին բادرազմի, վասն հավատո եւ վասն հայրենյաց, հիշյա հավուր մեզի կալստյան արքայության քո, արարժանի ողորմության, քավության եւ թողության մեղած, Թասավորյալ բայձարացում Սուրբ Սկոաչգոմյան տասուն, Զիտու եստեր եւ արարիչ ամենեցուն թադավոր գենթանյաց եւ մելոց, եւ քեզ վայելե փառք, իշխանություն եւ բադիվ, այժմ եւ միշտ եւ հավիտյանս հայդենից ամեն, օրհնյալ եղելուք շան Սուրբ Հոգին, երթայք խաղությամբ եւ Տեր Հիսուս Քրիստոս եղիցին ցեզ ընդ ամենեսյանդ. Amen.
Thank you for coming, everyone, and have a good night.